Albert Camus was born into poverty, silence, and blinding sunlight. And from these three forces, he would build one of the most powerful philosophical visions of the 20th century. He was born on November 7th, 1913, in Mondovi, a small town in French Algeria. Algeria, at the time, was not an independent nation, but a French colony, divided sharply between European settlers and the native Arab population. Camus' childhood unfolded within this divided world, and the tension between belonging and displacement would quietly shape his entire intellectual life. His father, Lucien Camus, was a farm worker of modest means who had been drafted into the French army during the First World War. When Albert was not yet 1 year old, his father was killed in the Battle of the Marne. Camus would grow up with almost no memory of him, raised instead by his mother, Catherine Camus, a woman of Spanish descent who was partially deaf and barely literate. She worked long hours cleaning houses to support the family. The household was not filled with books or intellectual discussion. It was filled with silence, labor, and survival. This early poverty left a permanent mark on Camus. He later wrote not with bitterness toward his childhood, but with clarity about its simplicity. He understood physical hardship from within. He knew what it meant to live without luxury, without certainty, and without the assumption that the world would provide comfort. At the same time, he was surrounded by the intense sunlight of North Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, the wide, open landscapes of Algeria. These physical sensations, heat, light, the smell of salt air, became deeply connected to his understanding of existence. For Camus, life was not an abstract, philosophical problem alone. It was something felt physically, something experienced in the body. His life changed because of one teacher. At primary school, a man named Louis Germain recognized Camus' intelligence and encouraged him to continue his education. Without this support, Camus likely would have left school early to work. Germain helped him obtain a scholarship to attend secondary school in Algiers. Camus never forgot this act of intervention. He understood from personal experience how fragile opportunity can be, how easily talent can disappear without guidance. This awareness later shaped his deep concern for justice and dignity. As a young man, Camus developed a love for sports, particularly football. He played as a goalkeeper, a position that requires alertness, responsibility, and the ability to react quickly under pressure. He later reflected that much of what he knew about morality he had learned from football. On the field, loyalty to the team mattered. Fair play mattered. Responsibility could not be avoided. These early experiences shaped his sense that ethical behavior is grounded not in abstract theory alone, but in shared human experience. At 17, Camus was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that would affect him repeatedly throughout his life. The illness forced him to abandon certain ambitions, including the possibility of a professional sports career and a conventional academic path. Tuberculosis introduced him early to physical fragility and the unpredictability of health. He learned that life can change suddenly, without warning. This awareness deepened his sensitivity to mortality. He knew from personal experience that existence is not guaranteed. Despite these obstacles, Camus pursued higher education at the University of Algiers, studying philosophy. His academic work focused partly on ancient Greek thought and early Christian philosophy. But even in his studies, he gravitated toward questions about suffering, meaning, and rebellion. He was particularly drawn to thinkers who confronted the tension between human longing for clarity and the apparent indifference of the universe. This tension would later become central to his philosophy. During the 1930s, Camus became briefly involved with the Communist Party in Algeria. He was motivated less by strict ideological commitment and more by a desire to address social injustice, particularly the inequality faced by the Arab population under colonial rule. However, he soon became disillusioned with the rigidity and dogmatism he encountered. Camus distrusted any system that demanded absolute loyalty or suppressed individual conscience. His political stance would remain complex throughout his life. He believed in justice and solidarity, but he resisted ideological extremism. Camus' early literary career began with journalism. He worked for newspapers in Algeria, writing about poverty, labor conditions, and political corruption. His reporting was direct and clear, avoiding exaggerated rhetoric. He believed in confronting reality as it is, not as one wishes it to be. This journalistic discipline sharpened his writing style. Even when he later wrote philosophical works, his language remained precise and accessible. He did not hide behind unnecessary complexity. In 1940, as the Second World War intensified, Camus moved to France. The country soon fell under Nazi occupation. During this period, Camus joined the French resistance, working as an editor for the underground newspaper Combat. In this role, he risked his life publishing articles that criticized totalitarianism and defended human dignity. The experience of living under occupation reinforced his understanding that political systems can become absurd in their cruelty, demanding obedience without reason. Yet even within oppression, individuals retain the capacity for moral choice. It was during these years that Camus wrote one of his most important philosophical essays, The Myth of Sisyphus, published in 1942. In this work, he introduced the concept that would define his intellectual legacy, the idea of the absurd. The absurd arises from the confrontation between two realities. On one side, human beings possess a deep desire for meaning, clarity, and order. On the other side, the universe offers no clear answers. It remains silent. The tension between human longing and cosmic indifference creates the absurd. Camus did not conclude that life is meaningless in a simple sense. Instead, he argued that the absence of guaranteed meaning does not require despair. The central philosophical question, he wrote, is whether life is worth living. His answer was yes, but not because life contains hidden metaphysical purpose. It is worth living because of the experience itself. Even within absurdity, human beings can choose how to respond. They can revolt, not through violence necessarily, but through refusal to surrender to hopelessness. He used the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus as a symbol. Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to push a rock up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, repeating the task endlessly. This image represents the repetitive and seemingly pointless aspects of human life. Yet Camus imagined Sisyphus aware of his condition, conscious of the futility, and still continuing. In that awareness lies freedom. The gods cannot control his inner attitude. Camus famously concluded that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. This idea did not suggest naive optimism. It suggested defiance. Even if the universe does not provide meaning, human beings can create dignity through conscious persistence. From poverty in Algeria to the intellectual circles of Paris, from illness to resistance against occupation, Albert Camus' life was shaped by confrontation with harsh reality. He did not look away from suffering. He did not invent comforting illusions. He looked directly at the silence of the universe, and he asked what it means to live anyway. Albert Camus did not remain only a philosopher of essays and abstract reflection. In the early 1940s, alongside The Myth of Sisyphus, he published the novel that would make him internationally famous, The Stranger. This short novel, simple on the surface yet profound underneath, became one of the defining works of 20th century literature. It tells the story of Massault, a French Algerian man who lives with emotional detachment from the expectations of society. The novel opens with the death of his mother, and Massault's reaction is strangely calm, almost indifferent. He does not perform grief in the way society expects. He does not cry publicly. He does not pretend to feel what he does not feel. Later, in a moment shaped by heat, sunlight, and confusion, he kills an Arab man on a beach in Algiers. The act itself is shocking, but what becomes even more disturbing is the trial that follows. Massault is judged not only for murder, but for his refusal to conform emotionally. The court condemns him less for the crime and more for not crying at his mother's funeral. Through this story, Camus explored the tension between individual authenticity and social expectation. Massault becomes a symbol of the absurd individual, someone who refuses to lie about his inner state even when society demands performance. The blazing Algerian sun in the novel is not just a background detail. It represents the physical intensity of existence, the overwhelming presence of the world that does not answer human questions. Massault does not invent meaning where he cannot find it. He accepts the indifference of the universe. And in the final pages, facing execution, he experiences a kind of clarity. He embraces the certainty of death and the randomness of existence. In that acceptance, he finds peace. The Stranger was controversial from the beginning. Some critics accused Camus of promoting moral indifference. Others misunderstood his portrayal of detachment as endorsement. But Camus was not celebrating emotional emptiness. He was exploring honesty. He was asking what remains when illusions fall away. His style was stripped down, almost cold, yet deeply precise. He avoided dramatic exaggeration. He wrote in clear, controlled language, allowing the philosophical weight to emerge naturally. At the same time, Camus was developing another major work, the play Caligula. In this drama, he examined what happens when someone confronts the absurd and responds not with revolt but with tyranny. Caligula, the Roman emperor, realizes that life is without inherent meaning and that death is unavoidable. Instead of accepting this condition with dignity, he uses it to justify cruelty. He pushes his power to destructive extremes, testing the limits of freedom. Through this character, Camus showed the danger of misinterpreting absurdity. If one concludes that nothing has meaning, one might believe that anything is permitted. Camus rejected this path. For him, awareness of the absurd must lead not to destruction, but to restraint and solidarity. During the years of Nazi occupation, Camus' writings became increasingly focused on resistance. His work with the underground newspaper combat sharpened his political voice. He wrote editorials calling for justice without vengeance after the war. He opposed both fascism and blind revenge. He believed that violence corrupts even when it claims to serve justice. This position placed him in tension with some of his contemporaries, particularly those who believed revolutionary violence could be morally justified. After the war ended, Camus emerged as a prominent public intellectual in France. Paris in the late 1940s was alive with philosophical debate. Existentialism, led by Jean-Paul Sartre, dominated intellectual circles. Although Camus was often grouped with the existentialists, he did not accept the label. Sartre emphasized radical freedom and the responsibility to create meaning through choice. Camus agreed that humans are free, but he rejected the idea that freedom alone could solve the problem of absurdity. For Camus, the absurd remained a permanent condition. It could not be overcome by constructing systems of meaning. It had to be lived with. This difference became more pronounced with the publication of Camus' book The Rebel in 1951. In this work, he examined the history of rebellion, from metaphysical revolt against God to political revolution. He argued that rebellion begins as a demand for dignity and justice. It says no to humiliation. But when rebellion turns into ideology, when it seeks total transformation of society at any cost, it can justify terror. Camus criticized revolutionary movements that excused mass violence in the name of future utopia. He believed that when humans try to impose absolute justice, they often create absolute oppression. The Rebel created a major break between Camus and Sartre. Sartre and others on the political left accused Camus of being too moderate, too cautious in his criticism of communism. Camus, however, refused to support any system that sacrificed individual lives for abstract ideals. He had seen how totalitarian regimes operate. He had witnessed occupation and censorship. He believed that moral limits must be preserved even in struggle. This intellectual conflict was painful for Camus. He valued friendship and dialogue, yet he remained firm in his position. His commitment was not to ideology, but to human dignity. He insisted that justice must be pursued without becoming injustice. Meanwhile, Camus continued to write fiction. In 1947, he published The Plague, a novel set in the Algerian city of Oran during a deadly epidemic. On the surface, it tells the story of doctors, journalists, and ordinary citizens responding to disease. But beneath the narrative lies an allegory of resistance against tyranny. The plague represents not only illness, but also fascism and moral corruption. The characters face suffering without clear explanation. There is no divine message, no grand design revealed. Yet many of them choose to act with courage and compassion. The Dr. Ruse, the central figure, does not claim heroism. He simply does his job day after day, fighting the disease even when success seems uncertain. Through the plague, Camus illustrated his philosophy in narrative form. The world may be indifferent. Disaster may strike without reason. But human beings can choose solidarity. They can care for one another. They can refuse to surrender to despair. This quiet perseverance, this daily commitment to decency, is Camus' answer to absurdity. By the early 1950s, Albert Camus was no longer just a writer from Algeria. He was one of the most influential thinkers in Europe. Yet he remained deeply connected to the landscapes of his childhood. The sunlight of Algeria, the poverty of his early years, the memory of his silent mother, all remained central to his identity. He never fully felt at home in Parisian intellectual circles. He carried within him the tension between two worlds, colonial Algeria and metropolitan France. This tension would grow even more intense as political unrest in Algeria began to rise, eventually leading toward war. Camus found himself in a painful position, torn between loyalty to the land of his birth and commitment to justice for all its people. His life was entering a new phase, one filled with moral complexity and public controversy. And once again, he would refuse simple answers. As Albert Camus moved into the 1950s, his life became increasingly shaped by a conflict that was not only political, but deeply personal: the growing crisis in Algeria. Algeria was not simply a distant colony to him. It was his birthplace, the landscape of his childhood, the place where his earliest memories had formed under the intense Mediterranean sun. Yet Algeria was also a land divided by injustice. The native Arab population lived with fewer rights, fewer opportunities, and less political power than the European settlers. As tensions escalated into violence, Camus found himself in an impossible position. He believed firmly in justice and equality, yet he also feared the destruction of the fragile coexistence that had shaped his life. He refused to support colonial oppression, but he also refused to support violence against civilians. His position satisfied neither side. To some, he appeared weak. To others, he appeared disloyal. But Camus was guided not by political convenience, but by moral clarity. He believed that human life itself must remain sacred, regardless of ideology. This moral tension reflected the deeper structure of his philosophy. Camus did not believe that history moved toward inevitable progress or perfect justice. He believed that human beings live within limits. These limits include mortality, suffering, and uncertainty. Attempts to create perfect systems often lead to cruelty because they treat individuals as means rather than ends. Camus insisted that rebellion must respect limits. To rebel is to say no to injustice, but it is also to say yes to shared humanity. Without this balance, rebellion becomes tyranny. In 1956, he published The Fall, one of his most psychologically complex novels. The story is told through the voice of Jean-Baptiste Clamence, a former lawyer who now lives in self-imposed exile in Amsterdam. Clamence speaks directly to an unnamed listener, gradually revealing his past and his moral failures. He describes a moment when he heard a woman fall into a river at night and did nothing to help her. This moment becomes a turning point. He realizes that his previous life, built on pride and the belief in his own virtue, was based on illusion. He begins to see that his moral superiority was a performance, a way to avoid confronting his own weakness. Through Clamence, Camus explored the theme of self-judgment. Human beings often judge others harshly while avoiding judgment of themselves. They create identities based on social approval, convincing themselves of their own righteousness. But when confronted with their own failure, these illusions collapse. Clements responds to this realization not with redemption, but with bitter honesty. He exposes the hypocrisy not only of himself, but of humanity. The Fall presents a darker vision than Camus' earlier works. It reflects his growing awareness of moral complexity and psychological depth. At the same time, Camus continued exploring the philosophical foundation of absurdity and revolt. He argued that the recognition of absurdity must not lead to despair or nihilism. Instead, it creates the possibility of freedom. If life has no predetermined meaning, then individuals are free to create value through their actions. This freedom is not limitless. It exists within the boundaries of mortality and human vulnerability. But within those limits, human beings can choose dignity. Camus rejected both religious certainty and ideological certainty. He did not believe that divine authority guaranteed meaning. But he also did not believe that political systems could create ultimate purpose. Meaning, for Camus, emerged through lived experience. It emerged through relationships, through creativity, through resistance to injustice, and through appreciation of existence itself. The beauty of nature, the warmth of sunlight, the presence of others. These experiences did not solve the absurd, but they made life worth living despite it. His writing style reflected this clarity. He avoided unnecessary abstraction. He wrote with precision, allowing philosophical insight to emerge through concrete images and experiences. The sea, the sun, the sky, and the physical world appear repeatedly in his work. These elements remind the reader that existence is not only intellectual, but sensory. Human beings do not live only in thought. They live in bodies, in environments, in time. In 1957, Albert Camus received the Nobel Prize in Literature at the age of 44. He was one of the youngest recipients in history. The award recognized not only his literary achievement, but his moral seriousness. In his Nobel Prize speech, Camus spoke about the responsibility of the writer. He rejected the idea that writers exist only to entertain or escape reality. He believed that writers must bear witness to truth, must defend human dignity, and must resist injustice. He described himself not as a judge standing above others, but as a witness standing beside them. Despite this global recognition, Camus remained personally modest. He never forgot his origins in poverty. He remained deeply connected to his mother, who had sacrificed greatly for his education. He once remarked that the Nobel Prize created distance between himself and the simple life he had known. Fame did not resolve the philosophical questions that had driven him. It did not remove the absurd. It did not provide ultimate answers. As he entered the final years of his life, Camus continued working on new projects. He began writing an unfinished novel titled The First Man, which was deeply autobiographical. In this work, he returned to the landscapes of his childhood, exploring memory, identity, and the relationship between past and present. The novel reflected a quieter, more reflective phase of his thinking. He was no longer focused only on abstract philosophical confrontation. He was exploring personal history, the emotional roots of his own existence. Yet beneath this quieter reflection, the central truth of his philosophy remained unchanged. The universe does not provide guarantees. It does not explain itself. It does not promise justice or meaning. And yet, within this silence, human beings continue to live, to choose, to love, and to resist. Camus believed that this persistence, this refusal to surrender to meaninglessness, was the essence of human dignity. Not victory, not certainty, but courage in the face of the unknown. In the final years of his life, Albert Camus seemed to be turning inward, not away from the world, but deeper into the roots of his own existence. After decades of confronting ideology, absurdity, rebellion, and political conflict, he began writing The First Man, a novel that was more personal than anything he had produced before. It was an attempt to return to the beginning, to childhood, to poverty, to his silent mother, to the bright Algerian sun that had shaped his senses before philosophy had shaped his language. In this unfinished manuscript, the main character searches for his father, trying to understand the man who had died in war before he could be known. This search was not only historical, but existential. Camus was trying to understand himself, to trace the origin of his moral clarity, his restraint, his refusal of extremism. He was revisiting the landscape that had made him. On January 4th, 1960, at the age of 46, Albert Camus died suddenly in a car accident in France. The crash was violent and unexpected. In his briefcase was the unfinished manuscript of The First Man. His death shocked the literary world. A life that had survived illness, war, occupation, and intellectual battle ended abruptly on a quiet road. There was no dramatic philosophical conclusion, no final speech, no symbolic farewell. His death itself reflected the very absurdity he had described for years. Life does not arrange itself into meaningful endings. It simply stops. Yet the impact of his work did not stop. In the decades after his death, Camus' influence continued to grow. Readers across cultures found something deeply human in his writing. He did not speak from a position of superiority. He did not offer complicated systems that required advanced training to understand. He spoke directly about fear, suffering, hope, injustice, and mortality. His philosophy did not depend on belief in heaven or trust in political utopia. It depended on something simpler and more demanding: the willingness to remain honest in a silent universe. At the center of Camus' thought stands the concept of the absurd. The absurd is not merely a feeling of confusion. It is the confrontation between the human need for clarity and the world's refusal to provide it. Human beings ask why. Why suffering? Why death? Why injustice? The universe does not answer. This silence creates tension. Many respond by escaping into comforting illusions, religious certainty, ideological fanaticism, or distraction. Camus rejected these escapes. He argued that true courage lies in facing the silence without denial. But he did not stop there. Facing the absurd does not mean surrendering to despair. Camus insisted that once we accept that life has no guaranteed meaning, we become free to live fully within its limits. We stop waiting for final answers. We stop postponing existence. We begin to value the present moment, the sunlight, the sea, friendship, laughter, simple acts of kindness. These do not solve the problem of mortality, but they make life vivid. His concept of revolt is equally central. Revolt is not violent rebellion alone. It is an inner refusal to give in to hopelessness. It is the decision to continue pushing the rock up the hill, even knowing it will roll back down. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus imagined the condemned figure not as defeated, but as conscious. The gods may control the external punishment, but they cannot control his awareness. In that awareness lies dignity. Camus believed that human beings are strongest when they refuse to lie to themselves about their condition and yet still choose to live. He also insisted on limits. This was perhaps his most controversial stance. In a century filled with totalitarian regimes and revolutionary violence, Camus argued that even in the pursuit of justice there must be boundaries. When rebellion abandons limits, it becomes oppression. When ideology claims absolute truth, it silences dissent. Camus stood in the uncomfortable middle ground, refusing both blind acceptance and destructive extremism. This position cost him friendships and political alliances, but he remained consistent. There is also a tenderness in his philosophy that is sometimes overlooked. Camus loved beauty. He loved the sea, the warmth of the sun on skin, the laughter of children, the smell of earth after rain. These sensory details appear again and again in his writing. He believed that awareness of mortality intensifies appreciation. Because life ends, it becomes precious. Because the universe is silent, human voices matter more. His relationship with his mother remained one of the deepest emotional anchors of his life. She was not a philosopher. She did not debate ideas. She worked quietly, endured hardship, and loved without intellectual explanation. Camus often described her silence not as emptiness, but as strength. In many ways, his philosophy mirrors that silence. It does not shout answers. It stands quietly in the presence of reality. Today, Camus is often placed within existentialism, yet his thought remains distinct. Where some existentialists focused on anxiety and radical freedom, Camus focused on clarity and measure. He did not celebrate despair. He did not romanticize chaos. He searched for balance, for a way to live honestly without cruelty. Albert Camus' life was not long, but it was intensely lived. From the poverty of colonial Algeria to the Nobel Prize stage, from tuberculosis to resistance against occupation, from literary fame to sudden death, he embodied the very tension he described. He did not escape absurdity. He walked through it. He did not invent comforting myths. He chose lucidity. In the end, Camus leaves us not with a system, but with a posture toward existence. Stand upright in the face of uncertainty. Refuse injustice without becoming unjust. Accept mortality without surrendering joy. Recognize that meaning is not handed down from the sky, but created in daily acts of courage and compassion. The universe may remain silent, but within that silence, human beings can still speak. And in speaking honestly, in living consciously, in loving despite fragility, they transform absurdity into dignity. That was Albert Camus' final gift.